Martín de Rada was born in Pamplona, Navarre, in 1533 into a noble family which, although it had seen better times, still retained certain privileges and had valuable connections in high society. Rada studied first in Paris and later in Salamanca. It was in Salamanca that he entered the Augustinian order, and from there he went to Mexico as a missionary. Martín de Rada arrived in Mexico with an unmatched reputation as a mathematician, astronomer, and astrologer. He is always portrayed surrounded by a variety of scientific implements, such as a globe on his desk and a telescope on his hands. But these objects allow for a double reading. They identify him as a scientific humanist, but also as an employee of Spain's colonial interests. Neither Marco Polo in earlier times nor the Jesuits in times to come were so immediately accountable to political power. They were much more freer than Rada, either individually or as an organization, to exclusively focus their interests on China. But who was Martín de Rada? With what frame of mind did he tackle the Chinese world when he first entered it? We'll try to find out by taking a look at his books, the ones he took with him to Asia, the ones he wrote, and the ones he brought back from China. On the ship that took him to Asia, space, as usual, was very scarce, and all Rada's belongings had to fit into a small trunk. With no room for superfluous things, the books and printed materials that Rada brought with him were, no doubt, his essential intellectual tools. Some of them were, of course, religious items. There was a breviary with which he refused to part even when asked by the demanding Fujian viceroy. He also brought with him a book by Fray Luis de Granada, a highly prolific author whose ascetic writings reached a pitch of popularity in the 16th century. No missionary baggage belonging to priests, friars, or Jesuits would have been complete without it. As we have already seen in a previous lecture, the first Chinese book to be printed in the Philippines was a translation of a book by Fray Luis de Granada. This is a trend that the Jesuits will also follow, translating it into both Japanese and Chinese. Rada also carried 5 small religious prints that he gave as a gift to the insistent viceroy. For the Chinese, the message conveyed in these prints was highly exotic and startlingly incongruous. 3 of them figured respectively the crucifixion, Christ tied to a pillar, and Christ's public humiliation as ex homo. For the Chinese, all this suffering was more reminiscent of public punishments than of divine greatness. And the 2 remaining images, featuring the coronation of Virgin Mary and the ecstasy of Saint Brigitte, suggested a woman's status that was nowhere to be seen in China. As was usual with Renaissance explorers, Rada also took some travel documents. He carried Marco Polo's book, and once in Asia also got hold of some Portuguese texts, probably just a few letters. But the collection of books that he took with him was rather scientific and technical. Most of the books were intended for astronomic or cartographic uses. He explains that he took for geometry Euclid and Archimedes. Those were 2 books that no Renaissance humanist would have left behind. Euclid's Elements, one of the most printed books of the Renaissance, provided the eternal forms that lie behind the changing appearances, and with them a mathematical way to interpret the universe that could be applied to a wide range of fields: war, architecture, navigation, cartography, and astronomy. Archimedes provided a way to apply mathematics to physics. Rada also took Regiomontano's book on triangles, an essential guide for trigonometry that was of crucial significance for both astronomers and navigators. For astronomy, he took Ptolemy and Copernicus. This was a peculiar pair because they were the proponents of quite different astronomical systems. Ptolemy stood by the geocentric theory, which placed the Earth at the center of the planetary system, while Copernicus argued the heliocentric theory that placed the Sun at the center of the system. Copernicus would be targeted by the religious zeal of the Counter-Reformation, but in 1564, when Rada left Mexico, Copernicus was still a sensible choice. His tables, that Rada also took, were of general use everywhere, and his book had been taught in Salamanca, where his heliocentric theory had gained some ardent supporters. In 1563, the Council of Trent banned Copernicus' text. But by the time this interdiction reached Mexico, Rada already had left with Copernicus in his trunk. As for Ptolemy, he could have taken the Almagest or the Tetrabiblos, which were the most influential books for Renaissance astronomy and astrology, respectively. Astronomy being the science of how the stars and planets move, and astrology the study of their influence on human lives. Even so, both could be used for astrological purposes, and astrology was Rada's biggest interest. Science and religion were essential for a Renaissance mind, but magic was not left behind. On the contrary, these three forms of knowledge, science, religion, and magic, were utterly intermingled. Rada's other books were directly related to astrology and divination, mostly to judiciary astrology, horoscopes, and ephemerides. In fact, in his last letter to Veracruz, his superior in Mexico and an outstanding humanist himself, Rada affirms, to the dismay of his superior, that he has written a book on judiciary astrology. Rada certainly used the books he took with him to write mainly about longitude and latitude. Indeed, that was the reason why he was in the Philippines. As early as 1570, he sent to the king a book about navigation and about the measurements of lands and oceans. But to Rada's dismay, his works were repeatedly lost in the fires that devastated the new colony and in the frequent shipwrecks that destroyed its ships. In fact, nothing has remained, not even his linguistic works. He is credited for having written a grammar and vocabulary of at least 3 languages: the Otomi, while in Mexico, the Cebuan while in Cebu, and the Chinese on his return from China. But all of them have been lost. All that remains of Rada's books are lists. Lists of what he took with him, as we have already seen, and lists of what he bought while he was in China. The list of the books that Rada bought in China is of course of paramount interest because it gives us a glimpse of what 16th century Chinese provincial bookshops were offering, and also provides a unique insight into the interests of a Renaissance humanist missionary. Rada's books were sent to Mexico, but they never reached Spain and have never been found.